Detroit was no longer the city of engines and steel it once proudly claimed to be. The factories that had once roared with life now stood silent, their broken windows staring like hollow eyes across streets littered with sandbags and barricades. The skyline was scarred by smoke columns rising from the suburbs, each one marking another clash, another neighborhood lost. Captain Michael Rain stood atop the rusted roof of an abandoned Ford plant, his boots crunching against shards of glass. His gaze swept across the horizon, where the faint glow of artillery fire flickered like a storm on the edge of the night. Beside him, Sergeant Emily Carter unfolded a worn map, her fingers tracing the red lines that marked enemy advances. "They're moving faster than we expected," Emily muttered, her voice steady but edged with tension. Michael's jaw tightened. "Detroit holds as long as we breathe. If this city falls, Chicago is next. And if Chicago falls, the heartland is gone." Below them, the streets pulsed with fragile life. Families huddled in basements, children clutching stuffed animals while the walls shook from distant blasts. Volunteers carried crates of water and medicine through alleys, their faces pale but determined. The city was afraid, but it was not broken. Then came the thunder. From the river's edge, the enemy unleashed its artillery. Shells screamed overhead, tearing into the old neighborhoods. The ground trembled beneath Michael's boots as fire blossomed across the skyline. He raised his hand, signaling his unit. Soldiers scrambled into position, rifles ready, eyes burning with defiance. Detroit had become a fortress, and every street was now a battlefield. The war had arrived at its gates, and Michael knew this was only the beginning. Chicago had always been a city of bridges and towers, its skyline a proud forest of steel and glass. Now those towers stood like watchmen over a city bracing for siege. The river that once carried tourists and traders had become a defensive line, its waters patrolled by gunboats hastily armed with salvaged cannons. Colonel David Alvarez, commander of the Midwestern Defense Corps, surveyed the city from the top of Willis Tower. His officers gathered around him, their radios buzzing with reports of enemy movements. "Detroit is holding, but barely," Alvarez said, his voice echoing in the steel chamber. "If they break through, Chicago becomes the next wall. We cannot let it fall." Lieutenant Sarah Monroe, a strategist known for her sharp instincts, pointed to the map spread across the table. "They'll come from the south, through Gary and Hammond. The highways are open corridors. We need barricades here, here, and here." Her finger tapped the intersections like drumbeats of urgency. Meanwhile, in the streets below, civilians prepared for the storm. Shopkeepers boarded up their stores, turning them into makeshift bunkers. Families carried supplies into subway tunnels, where the city had carved out underground shelters. The air was heavy with fear, but also with defiance. Chicagoans had survived fire, economic collapse, and crime waves. Now they would survive war. The first assault came at dawn. Enemy tanks rolled across the southern highways, their engines growling like beasts. Artillery thundered from the outskirts, shaking the bridges. Alvarez's forces responded with precision strikes, collapsing overpasses to slow the advance. Explosions lit the skyline, painting the morning in fire and smoke. Sarah Monroe directed the counterattack, her voice steady over the radio. "Hold the bridges. Do not let them cross the river. Chicago stands today, or America falls tomorrow." As the battle raged, the city itself seemed to roar in defiance. Every street became a trench, every skyscraper a fortress. Chicago was no longer just a city, it was a symbol. And symbols, Alvarez knew, could not be allowed to die. St. Louis had always been a city of crossings, the Mississippi River flowing like a silver blade through its heart, the Gateway Arch rising as a symbol of hope and progress. But now, that arch loomed over a city preparing for war, its shining steel reflecting the fire of distant bombardments. General Rebecca Hayes, commander of the Western Defense Line, stood on the riverbank as barges loaded with sandbags and artillery shells drifted past. Her officers clustered around her, their faces grim. "Chicago is holding for now," Hayes said, her voice carrying over the roar of engines. "But if they break through, St. Louis becomes the next wall." We must make this river our shield. Captain Daniel Brooks, a veteran of Detroit's defense, nodded. The Mississippi is wide, but not wide enough. They'll try to cross with pontoons. We need mines, gunboats, and every rifle we can spare. The city itself had transformed. Bridges were rigged with explosives, ready to collapse at a moment's notice. Factories churned out ammunition instead of cars, and schools had become command posts. Civilians dug trenches in parks, their hands blistered but determined. The Gateway Arch, once a monument to peace, now served as a lookout tower, its curved summit bristling with radio antennas. At dawn, the enemy came. Columns of armored vehicles rolled toward the river, their engines echoing like thunder. Artillery fire rained down on the eastern bank, shaking the ground beneath Hayes's boots. She raised her binoculars and saw the first wave of pontoons sliding into the water. "Open fire," she commanded. Cannons roared from the riverfront, shredding the fragile boats. Gunboats surged forward, their decks blazing with machine gun fire. The Mississippi erupted into chaos, smoke, fire, and shattered steel drifting downstream. Yet the enemy pressed on. More pontoons followed, shielded by tanks and artillery. The battle for St. Louis had begun, and Hayes knew it would be brutal. But she also knew the city's spirit. St. Louis was not just defending itself. It was defending the river, the heartland, and the very idea of survival. New Orleans was a city of music and rivers, of jazz echoing through narrow streets and the Mississippi winding like a serpent toward the sea. But now, the music had fallen silent. The French Quarter's balconies were draped not with flowers but with camouflage nets, and the river carried not steamboats but armored barges bristling with guns. Major Anthony Greene, a son of Louisiana, stood at the edge of Jackson Square, staring at the cathedral spires that rose above the city. "This is the last southern gate," he told his soldiers. "If New Orleans falls, the Gulf is theirs. And if they control the Gulf, they control the nation's lifeline." Captain Laura Bennett, his second-in-command, adjusted her rifle and glanced toward the levees. "The river is our strength, but also our weakness. If they breach the levees, the city floods. We fight not just for New Orleans, but for every town along the Mississippi." The city had transformed into a fortress. The Superdome, once a stadium of cheers, now served as a command center. The Garden District's mansions had become barracks, their grand halls echoing with the clatter of weapons. Civilians dug trenches along Canal Street, their hands blistered but their spirits unbroken. Even the jazz musicians had joined the fight, their horns traded for rifles, their rhythm now the cadence of marching boots. At dusk, the enemy struck. Gunfire erupted along the riverfront as armored barges pushed toward the docks. Artillery shells screamed overhead, shattering buildings and sending flames into the night sky. Greene's forces responded with ferocity, unleashing a storm of fire from the levees. The Mississippi became a battlefield, its waters boiling with explosions. Laura Bennett's voice rang through the radio, "Hold the docks. Do not let them land." Her words carried across the chaos, steady and unyielding. Soldiers fought from rooftops, from alleyways, from the shadows of the cathedral. New Orleans roared back. The city that had survived hurricanes and floods now faced war, and it refused to bow. Greene knew the battle would be long, but he also knew the spirit of New Orleans, resilient, defiant, unbreakable. Houston was a city of oil and space, of skyscrapers rising above sprawling suburbs and the NASA command center whispering of stars. But now, its towers were draped in camouflage, and its highways had become arteries of war. The hum of traffic was replaced by the rumble of armored convoys, and the city's proud skyline glowed with searchlights scanning the night. General Marcus Caldwell, a seasoned commander hardened by the battles of Detroit and Chicago, stood inside the George R. Brown Convention Center, now transformed into a war headquarters. Maps covered the walls, each marked with red arrows pushing relentlessly toward the Gulf. New Orleans is holding, but the enemy is regrouping, Caldwell said to his officers. Houston is their next prize. If they take this city, they take the oil, the ports, and the skies. Major Sofia Ramirez, a pilot from Ellington Field, leaned forward. "We can't let them dominate the air. Our fighters must strike before their bombers reach the refineries. If the oil burns, Houston burns with it." The city prepared with grim determination. The Johnson Space Center became a command post, its mission control screens now tracking enemy movements instead of rockets. Oil refineries along the ship channel were fortified with anti-aircraft batteries. Civilians dug trenches in suburban parks, while engineers rigged the highways with barricades and traps. Houston's spirit was fierce, a city that had faced hurricanes and floods was now bracing for war. At midnight, the assault began. Enemy bombers roared across the sky, dropping fire upon the refineries. Caldwell's forces responded with a storm of anti-aircraft fire, streaks of light tearing through the darkness. Ramirez led her squadron into the night, their jets screaming upward to meet the invaders. Explosions lit the sky, painting the city in fire and smoke. On the ground, tanks clashed along Interstate 10, their cannons echoing through the suburbs. Soldiers fought from overpasses, from rooftops, from the shadows of skyscrapers. Houston roared back, its defenses unyielding. Caldwell's voice thundered through the radios, "Hold the city. Houston is the wall between them and the heart of Texas." The battle raged through the night, but Houston did not break. Its towers stood tall, its people defiant. The city of oil and space had become a fortress, and Caldwell knew that as long as Houston stood, the war's tide could still be turned. Phoenix, the desert city of sun and stone, had always thrived in the heat. Its sprawling suburbs stretched across the desert floor, guarded by mountains that rose like natural walls. But now, those walls were trembling under the thunder of war. The desert winds carried smoke instead of dust, and the city streets echoed not with the hum of traffic but with the roar of armored convoys. Brigadier General Thomas Whitaker, commander of the Southwestern Defense, stood at the edge of Camelback Mountain, surveying the valley below. His binoculars caught the glint of enemy armor moving across the desert. "Phoenix is the gateway to the west," he told his officers. "If they take this city, Los Angeles is next. We cannot let the desert swallow us." Captain Rachel Torres, a native of Arizona, pointed to the map spread across the hood of a Humvee. "They'll come through the desert passes. We can use the terrain. Ambushes here, artillery here, and barricades along the highways. The desert is harsh, let's make it harsher." The city prepared with determination. The University of Arizona Stadium became a supply depot, its bleachers stacked with crates of ammunition. Suburban cul-de-sacs were fortified with sandbags, while the desert highways were mined and rigged with traps. Civilians carried water and supplies to the front lines, their resilience forged by years of surviving the desert's unforgiving heat. At dawn, the assault began. Enemy tanks rolled across the desert, their engines growling like beasts. Artillery fire thundered from the mountains, shaking the valley. Whitaker's forces responded with precision strikes, unleashing rockets from hidden positions. Explosions lit the desert sky, painting the horizon in fire and smoke. Rachel Torres led her unit into the fray, her voice steady over the radio. "Hold the passes. Phoenix stands today, or the West falls tomorrow." Soldiers fought from rooftops, from desert ridges, from the shadows of cactus groves. Phoenix roared back. The city that had endured droughts and heat waves now faced war, and it refused to bow. Whitaker knew the battle would be brutal, but he also knew the desert spirit, relentless, unforgiving, unbreakable. Los Angeles, the city of stars and endless sprawl, had become a fortress of concrete and steel. The Hollywood Hills, once glittering with mansions and lights, now bristled with artillery batteries. The freeways that had carried millions of cars each day were barricaded with tanks and sandbags, their overpasses transformed into sniper nests. The city of dreams had become a city of war. General Adrian Cole, commander of the Pacific Defense, stood on the rooftop of City Hall, gazing across the skyline. Smoke rose from the outskirts, where skirmishes had already begun. "Los Angeles is more than a city," he told his officers. "It is a symbol. If it falls, the West Coast falls." And if the West Coast falls, the ocean is theirs. Colonel Jessica Lee, a strategist born in California, spread a map across the table. They'll come through the desert, through San Bernardino and Riverside. The highways are their lifelines. We must choke them here, here, and here. Her finger tapped the map with precision, marking ambush points along the 10 and 405 freeways. The city prepared with grim resolve. The Staples Center became a command post, its arena filled not with cheers but with rows of soldiers. Studios in Hollywood churned out propaganda films to rally morale, while the ports of Long Beach bristled with naval defenses. Civilians dug trenches in Griffith Park, their hands blistered but their spirits unbroken. Even the film crews joined the fight, their cameras replaced by rifles, their scripts by battle orders. At dawn, the enemy struck. Columns of tanks rolled through the desert passes, their engines growling like beasts. Artillery fire thundered from the outskirts, shaking the city's foundations. Cole's forces responded with ferocity, unleashing rockets from hidden positions in the hills. Explosions lit the skyline, painting the morning in fire and smoke. Jessica Lee's voice rang through the radios, "Hold the freeways. Do not let them reach downtown." Soldiers fought from rooftops, from alleyways, from the shadows of skyscrapers. Los Angeles roared back, its defenses unyielding. The City of Stars had become a battlefield, and Cole knew the fight would be brutal. But he also knew the spirit of Los Angeles, resilient, defiant, unbreakable. The siege had begun, and the West Coast's fate now hung in the balance. San Francisco, the city of bridges and fog, had always been a beacon of resilience. The Golden Gate Bridge stretched across the bay like a sentinel, its red towers rising defiantly against the gray mist. But now, the bridge was rigged with explosives, its cables bristling with defensive guns. The city of innovation had become a fortress. Admiral Jonathan Pierce, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood at Fort Point beneath the bridge, watching the waves crash against the rocks. San Francisco is the key to the coast, he told his officers. If they take the bay, they take the ports. And if they take the ports, the Pacific is lost. Commander Elena Wu, a strategist born in Oakland, spread a map across the hood of a jeep. They'll come from the sea, through the bay. Amphibious landings here, here, and here. We must hold the shoreline, or the city falls. The city prepared with determination. Fisherman's Wharf became a supply depot, its piers stacked with crates of ammunition. Tech companies converted their campuses into command centers, their servers now tracking enemy movements instead of data streams. Civilians dug trenches in Golden Gate Park, their hands blistered but their spirits unbroken. Even the cable cars were repurposed, their tracks carrying supplies to the front lines. Elena Wu's voice rang through the radios, "Hold the bridge. Do not let them cross." Soldiers fought from rooftops, from alleyways, from the shadows of Chinatown. San Francisco roared back, its defenses unyielding. The city of bridges had become a battlefield, and Pierce knew the fight would be brutal. But he also knew the spirit of San Francisco, resilient, defiant, unbreakable. The battle for the bay had begun, and the fate of the Pacific now hung in the balance. The war had carved scars across the nation, from Detroit's steel ruins to the fog-shrouded Bay of San Francisco. Cities once alive with music, industry, and dreams now stood as fortresses, their streets etched with the memory of fire and defiance. Yet amid the destruction, a strange silence had settled over the Pacific coast. Los Angeles still smoldered, its towers blackened but unbroken. San Francisco's bridges stood tall, their cables scarred but intact. Seattle, the northern bastion, had braced itself for the storm but never saw the full fury arrive. The enemy, blooded and exhausted, had halted at the edge of the continent. The ocean had become the final wall, and America's western cities had held. General Adrian Cole stood on the pier at Long Beach, staring at the horizon where the Pacific stretched endlessly. Beside him, Admiral Jonathan Pierce lowered his binoculars. "They won't come again," Pierce said quietly. "Not now. Not after this." Cole nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the sea. We've lost too much to call it victory. But we endured. And endurance is its own kind of triumph. Across the nation, survivors began to rebuild. In Detroit, families returned to shattered neighborhoods, planting gardens among the ruins. In Chicago, bridges were repaired, their steel beams rising once more. In New Orleans, jazz returned to the streets, its rhythm defiant against silence. Houston's refineries roared back to life, their flames symbols of resilience. Phoenix's desert winds carried not smoke but the promise of renewal. The war had tested every city, every soul. It had demanded sacrifice, courage, and unity. And though the scars would never fade, the spirit of the nation had endured. The final chapter was not written in fire or blood, but in silence, the silence of a coast that had held, the silence of a people who refused to bow, the silence of a nation that, though battered, still stood.